Describe the structure and explain the function of the male and female human reproductive system.
Now, the female reproductive system is designed to carry out several functions. Now, this includes the production of the female egg cells that is necessary for reproduction. The reproductive system also produces female sex hormones that is important in maintaining the reproductive cycle, and the function of the external female reproductive structures or the genitals is twofold. Now, it helps to enable the sperm enter the body, and it also protects the internal genital organs from infectious organisms. So unlike the female reproductive system, most of the male reproductive system is located outside of the body. And the same for the female reproductive system. Now, the male reproductive system also has many functions. Now, these include in producing, maintaining, and transporting the sperm or the male reproductive cells and the protective fluid, which is the semen. It also helped in discharging the sperm within the female reproductive tract during sex or copulations, and they also produce and secrete male sex hormones that is responsible in maintaining the male reproductive system.
Differentiate between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction, external and internal fertilization, and direct and indirect development.
So there are two types of reproduction that animals undergo. So we have the asexual reproduction and the sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is a type of a reproduction that involves only one parent whose offsprings are genetically identical to their parent and to each other. So, asexual reproduction requires minimal energy, and it is very advantageous in environments that do not change over time. So, animals that undergo asexual reproductions include lizards and bees, whose unfertilized eggs can mature into asexually produced adults. So, sexual reproduction is another type of reproduction where it is extremely common among animals. So, unlike asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction requires two parents, where each of the parents contributes half their DNA to their offspring. Now, sexual reproduction entails high energy costs for attracting mates, copulating, and defending against rivals. So there are many animals that undergoes this type of reproduction. So that includes cats, dogs, rabbits, and even us humans. So fertilizations can take place in two types. You have the internal fertilizations and the external fertilizations. So external fertilization is when males and females release gametes into the same environment, and fertilization takes place outside of the body. Now, it is very common in aquatic animals such as frogs and sea urchins. So internal fertilization, on the other hand, is when a male deposits his sperm inside the woman's or a female's body, where the fertilization would occur. So it is very occurring on mammals and birds, non-avian reptiles, and even humans. So there are two types of development: indirect development and direct development. So with indirect development, the animal's birth form is very different from its adult form. So when the egg hatches from the egg to the larval form, now the larva undergoes a drastic metamorphosis in order to achieve its adult form. Now, direct development is when an animal after birth or emergence from an egg differs from an adult in a comparatively minor details, in that the infant resembles a smaller version from its parents, and when there is no larval stage nor metamorphosis, and the most obvious change is the growth of the animal.
Describe the events associated with human sperm and egg production and explain how hormones influence them.
So spermatogenesis or sperm development begins at puberty. So the germ cells are formed in the developing fetus and stay inactive inside the testis until puberty. So at puberty, the spermatogenesis or the sperm development begins to occur and continues constantly throughout childhood. So spermatogenesis starts with germ cells. Now the germ cells at the periphery of each seminiferous tubule undergo mitosis to produce primary spermatocytes. Now, the primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 1 in order to form two haploid secondary spermatocytes. So the secondary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 2 in order to form four haploid spermatids. Now the spermatids mature into sperm cells. Now as they complete maturations, now the sperm cells are released into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. So for the hormones that influence the male reproductive functions, now the hypothalamus secretes the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or the GnRH, that regulates the production of the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone by the anterior pituitary. Now, the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone stimulate the testes to release testosterone inside the seminiferous tubules, and then the testosterone then triggers spermatogenesis, or the sperm development. So the egg development, or the oogenesis, is pretty much similar to that of the spermatogenesis, or the sperm development, where for the oogenesis, it begins with germ cells, where the germ cells divide by mitosis before the female is born, giving rise to the primary oocytes. Now, the primary oocytes are then arrested at the meiosis prophase 1. So, primary oocytes are on pause until puberty. So, for each month after puberty begins, one primary oocyte completes meiosis 1. So, for each developing primary oocyte is nested in a fluid-like follicle. So, secondary oocyte ruptures the follicle, where the meiosis 1 produces two haploid cells, the secondary oocyte and a polar body, which eventually decomposes, although it may divide into two polar bodies first. Now, the secondary oocyte is then released from the ovary into the uterine tube in an event called ovulation. So secondary oocytes leave the ovaries. So following ovulations, now the ruptured follicle transforms into a gland called the corpus luteum. Meanwhile, meiosis halts at metaphase 1 and does not resume unless a sperm contacts the secondary oocyte. So if a sperm fertilizes the secondary oocytes, meaning that it completes the meiosis 2. So the result is a fertilized egg and a polar body that continues to the uterus. If an egg cell is not fertilized, it travels to the uterus without completing meiosis. So for the hormones that influence female reproductive function, so the hypothalamus secretes the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or the GnRH, that regulates the production of the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone by the anterior pituitary. So the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone stimulate the ovaries to release the progesterone and the estrogen, which targets the uterine lining. So the progesterone and the estrogen regulate the ovulation and the menstruations of females. Now, hormonal fluctuations produce two interrelated cycles. So the ovarian cycle is regulated by the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, while the menstrual cycle is regulated by the estrogen and the progesterone.
Describe the events in human fertilization until childbirth, particularly the appearance of sex differences and what triggers them.
So the sperm swim through the follicle. So the outer layer of the follicle cells surrounds a thin, jelly-like layer of proteins and carbohydrates that encases the oocyte. So the sperm squeezes between the follicle cells, and then the acrosome bursts, so spilling the enzymes that digest both the outer layers. So the sperm fuse with the secondary oocyte. So fertilization begins when the outer membranes of the one sperm cell and the secondary oocyte touch. So the sperm's head releases its DNA as it enters the secondary oocyte. Meanwhile, the female cell completes meiosis. So the sperm's DNA and the egg's DNA combine, completing the formation of the zygote. About 24 hours after the fertilization, the zygote divides for the first time, beginning a period of rapid mitotic cell division called cleavage. So a few days after fertilization, now the zygote has developed into a fluid-filled ball of cells called a blastocyst. So the cells on the inside of the blastocyst form the inner cell mass, which will develop into an embryo itself. Now, the inner cell mass is also the source of embryonic stem cells. So around 7 days after fertilization, now the blastocyst becomes embedded in the endometrium. So during implantations, the blastocyst digests and obtains nutrients from the uterine lining. So as the pre-embryo continues to develop, one layer of the embryonic disc becomes the ectoderm and another layer becomes the endoderm. So soon, a middle mesoderm layer forms on the ectoderm, completing the formation of the gastrula. So during the second week of the development, the implantation is complete. So the embryonic stage begins after implantation. So starting around 3 weeks, now the embryo produces structures that support its development. So the chorionic villi project into the uterine lining with and exchange nutrients with the maternal blood. The amniotic cavity contains fluid that cushions the embryo and maintains constant temperature and pressure. So there are four membranes that support, nourishes, and protects the embryo. So the chorion, amnion, allantois, and yolk sac are evolutionary, conserved structures found in all animals with amniotic eggs. So organ formation takes place during the embryonic stage. So for example, sex differences become apparent between 7 weeks and 9 weeks after fertilization as the genitals develop. So the fetal stage begins at the 9th week. So during this stage, the organs become functional, the bones replace the cartilage, and the nerves and muscles begin to coordinate actions. So near the end of pregnancy, the digestive and the respiratory systems mature and the neural connections form in the brain. And the birth occurs around 38 weeks.
Explain how contraceptives prevent pregnancy.
There are several contraceptives that people use in today's time. Abstinence is the most effective contraceptive in that the sperm would never encounter the egg. Several contraceptives also include tubal ligations for female or vasectomy for male, in which these are surgical procedures which help prevent the sperm and the egg from meeting. So hormone contraceptions also prevent reproduction, such as pills, patches, vaginal rings, and implants, which contain synthetic forms of progesterone and therefore prevents ovulation. So by preventing ovulations, then if no egg is released, then fertilization cannot occur.
Give examples of sexually transmitted infections.
So there are many diseases that can be transmitted to people during sex. Now for viruses, we have the genital warts, the cervical cancers, and your genital herpes. And the most common and the most rampant viruses that is very occurring here in the Philippines is the human immunodeficiency virus or the HIV/AIDS. Now, as for the bacteria, we have the syphilis, we have the chlamydia, and the gonorrhea. Then others include the candidiasis for the fungi and trichomonosis for the protists.